everybody. Today Mihap and I are going to be showing you how to pitch a tarp. Now there's a lot that goes into pitching a tarp, like site selection and more specific things within site selection, like choosing to go under a tree or staying away from water, stuff like that. And that's going to be covered in a separate video because that's a much larger topic. Today we're primarily just going to be showing you how we pitch our tarps and the little methods and tricks we use to do so. Let's do it. Alright, so there's three things you need when you're going to set up your tarp. Pretty basic. You need your tarp, obviously. Your stakes. My favorite stakes to use are the Vargo titanium shepherd's hook stakes. You can see those here. They've got the orange head on them. They're about 6 inches long. I've used these in all sorts of conditions and they do extremely well. They don't pull out. They hold up in all sorts of different soil types and I'm a huge fan. And finally, you need your trekking poles to pitch your tarp. So the first thing I do when I get into camp to set up my tarp is set my trekking poles to the right height. Now these are going to be different for every different type of tarp you're using, so you're going to have to get to know your own tarp to figure out what the right pole heights are for you. Once you get them dialed in, you can actually put a little notch on the pole with a permanent marker. That way you can quickly adjust to it if you ever need to. For myself, my tarp requires 2 different height poles, one shorter one at the feet because you don't need a lot of room down there, and a taller one at the head, just so you can sit up and move around in the tarp a bit. For my head pole, I normally do it about up to my waist. So I set the bottom segment of the pole, which is the thicker one, to 110. And I set the top segment of the pole to 105, right there. You can see it comes up just about to my hip bone. That's a little extra height. If I need to go lower in storm mode, I'll lower it. And if I need more room, I can actually raise it too. I don't often do that though. Now for the bottom pole, I only set one segment, so I leave the top segment up here closed. And I set the bottom one to either 110 or 115. I'm going to go 110 on this one. And that's plenty of room. Comes up to just under my hip bone, which is enough room to let my feet have air, but you really don't need a lot of height there. And lowering that into the tarp keeps the rain from splashing in. The next thing I do once I have the 2 poles set to the right height is actually set them at the head and foot of the tarp where I want to pitch my tarp. So I've got my ground sheet laid out here where I want to camp for the night. I'm going to put my foot pole down here and I'll just kind of let it hit the ground. I'll put my head pole up here and then I can start to pitch my tarp. Now I'm not going to go into site selection like I mentioned earlier, but I will say that there's a breeze kind of coming this way over this little saddle here. So I want to put my broad side of the tarp into that breeze, which is heading this way. And that keeps it from traveling through my tarp and blowing me all night. It actually hits the broad side of my tarp and kind of disperses around it. And yeah, I do get a breeze under there, but it's not nearly as bad as if you had pitched the door into the breeze. That's the basics. I'm going to show you how to set up the tarp now. So whenever I pack my tarp, I always pack it head end first and then the foot end sticking out. That way I always know which end I'm grabbing. So this is the foot end. I'm going to throw it by the foot end pole. And the head end goes up here. Now I'm going to go to the foot end, put up the pole, slide the D-ring onto it, and I just raise the tarp about to where I want it to be. And I stake out the 2 sides of the tarp, but not the main ridge line yet. And I'm staking them out fairly taut here. I'm not planning on having to move these after I set up the tarp. Okay, so now I've got the 2 sides laid out. I don't have the ridge line done yet, but what I'm going to do is actually move to the head of the tarp before I do the ridge line here. And what I like to do is just grab the actual ridge line of the tarp and I walk with it, keep it taut so that the pole doesn't fall down on the foot end. Then I'll walk over to the head end, plug in the trekking pole to the top of the tarp, and the first thing I'm going to set up here is the actual ridge line. Once the ridge line is set, you can see that it kind of freestands on its own. So what I'm going to do is stake out these 2 side ends here and then do the ridge line over there, and that'll be it. Now, if I notice any sagging, like you see right here, that means that one of the corners isn't quite at the angle or pulled out as tightly as it should be. So what I'm going to do is go back and readjust the corners of the tarp just to make sure it's pulled taut. So you can see a nice tight pitch here. The ridge line is coming up, going over and heading down really straight. I like to leave the trekking pole here by the door a little bit crooked. It doesn't really affect the pitch, but it does give me a lot of room and sort of a door access on this side of the tarp. If you put it perfectly in the middle, sometimes it's a little hard to squeeze between the two sides of the tarp. On the corners of the tarp, you should have the guy lines coming pretty much straight out of this angle here. If they're off too far to one side, you're going to notice a little bit of sag in the tarp, and it's not ideal. So if you can kind of picture this as a triangle, you want the guy line to shoot straight out of that triangle and into the ground. And then here, if you look at the stake, you can see it's all the way into the ground, very secure. There's no chance of that pulling out. Because it's in the ground, it's not going to bend or anything like that, and it's just going to hold much better when it's all the way in. So make sure all of your stakes are into the ground if they can be. Now you can see on the foot end here, I have a fairly tall pitch, which is great for room, but if it were really coming down, something I would do is actually lower this pole, which would fan out the sides of the tarp and give me more coverage from rain. And I'll do a quick little demonstration here and show you how I would pitch this tarp for storm mode. So what storm mode on a tarp is essentially pitching it very low and wide. So it covers more area on the ground, but it's pitched lower, so wind has less effect on it, and it covers more surface area, meaning you have more room to stay dry and less chance of rain actually coming down on the side of the tarp and splashing in, because it cuts off the angle of attack on it. So what you'll notice in storm mode is instead of pitching the tarp directly from the corner tie-outs, I've actually added a little bit of length to the guy lines, and that gives you a greater angle from the ridgeline of the tarp, which means that the tarp is going to come out a little bit farther and give you a little more coverage as well. And then again, I lowered both of the poles, decreased the height, and that decreases the angle at which the wind hits this. You can see that's a lot of coverage here. Even though this is technically a one-person tarp, if I pitch it in storm mode, it can definitely cover 2 people. And then on my tarp, I have these center tie-outs here, halfway down the tarp. And what they do is allow me to stake this out in case it's really windy, and that just cuts down on the flapping if there is any. Alright, I have one more mode I use. I just call it super storm mode, and this is when it's super windy, really rainy. I've pitched it this way maybe twice on all 3 of the long trails, so I don't use this mode often, but it keeps the tarp from blowing away, and it keeps rain from whipping under the tarp when it's really blowing sideways. Essentially all I do, this is already in storm mode here, what I do is take these corner tie-outs that are facing the wind, say the wind is coming from this way, which it is, this side of the tarp will be on the ground, and that will just keep the rain from blowing under it. And I'll just do that real fast here. I've got these little tie-out loops. I normally have a stretchy elastic loop that helps keep the tarp taut overnight. In superstorm mode, I use these really tight Amsteel loops that don't stretch at all, but they keep it straight to the ground. Okay, you can see that entire side of the tarp is basically on the ground, and that just cuts off any rain blowing in from the wind. And surprisingly, you might not expect it, but I actually leave that side of the tarp up, and it just helps when wind does come through. That helps to actually shed the wind, so it's not creating like a trap for the wind. Well, that's it. It's not exactly rocket science, but it has kept me dry on all 3 long trails that I've done, and it's what I do to this day. Hope that helps you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll get back to you.